Welcome along to the Andrew Eborn Show, and I'm delighted that my special guest today is Nick Pope. Now, Nick, the last time I saw you was back at Lord Wandsworth College, where we were both at school in the 1980s. And if I remember rightly, you were following your father into the Ministry of Defence and subsequently worked for the British government for 21 years. Subject to the Official Secrets Act, what can you tell us about that?
The job for which I'm best known is having run their small UFO program. But I also, in my time, had a job dealing with personnel policy issues on the Air Force side. So, for example, we were quite involved in the review that led to women being able to fly as pilots in the Royal Air Force. I had a financial policy job where my duties included negotiating with film and TV companies about using defense assets. So, I mean, quite literally sitting down, for example, with Barbara Broccoli and talking about, can we use HMS Westminster in the latest Bond film? And I said, what do you want to do with it? And she said, well, sink it. Well, not literally, but in the movie. So we got involved in that. And my final posting before I decided to take early retirement was as an acting deputy director in DDEF-SCI, Directorate of Defense Security. And we were obviously post 9/11, counterterrorism was at the heart of pretty much everything we did. And I got to do some fascinating things and go to some fascinating places. I went on a short hop over to Kosovo, and I did two very short, I mean, literally days, but trips to Iraq. And you see now, I've lived in the US long enough that I say things like Iraq and not Iraq. So, and earlier
Are you a
you'll have
tomato or
spotted,
tomato guy?
I'm tomato now,
You are
and
tomato. I'm potato. I love
I
it. It's
know.
fantastic. It's a
And I
good
think
influence on that
earlier,
sort of side.
yeah, I think earlier, even in this interview, I do believe I slipped in reference to the fall semester or something
I
like
know you
that,
did.
as
I
opposed
was
to,
wonderful. See, our good old school days together, we would have ripped each other no end for that. I sort of let you get away with it now. It's wonderful. I love it. So August
well,
of
I've been here. Yes, I've been here. I suppose Elizabeth and I got married in well, we met at the very end of 2010, and then we got married about 3 months later, and then obviously I had to sell the London place and wind things up in the UK, apply for the green card, and I moved over in January 2012. So I've been here long enough to pick up the language.
so very good. So you basically over here. You were how long? You was it 21 years? How long were you at the MOD?
Yes, 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and I took early retirement in I think it was 2006, and then from 2006 to 2010, I was just based in London, and I was doing a mixture of consultancy and spokesperson work. I mentioned earlier that I do quite a lot of work with film and TV companies. What I tend to do is, as I say, I do some consultancy on storylines, a lot because of my time investigating UFOs for the Ministry of Defense, a lot of alien themed movies, of course, out there, and TV shows and video games. So I'll do some consultancy and I'll do some spokesperson work where, as part of the marketing campaign, we'll run stories about how realistic or not some of this is, and what would happen if any of this happened in real life. So I do that. I do some TV work myself, of course. I've done some hosting and some contributing, some consultancy. I do some journalism. I mean, I've written, for example, about this story. About two big stories that I've been involved in directly. I mean, the declassification and release of the Ministry of Defense UFO files, but more recently, what's going on here in the US with the revelations about the Pentagon's ATIP program, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the sightings in parallel filmed on forward-looking infrared camera by various US Navy jets chasing these things. And I've written about that, for example, in The Guardian back in the UK. I've written for the New York Post here in the US. So I did that, freelance journalism and broadcasting, and then, as I say, moved over to the States in January 2012, where I pretty much continued to do a lot of TV work, and a lot of conferences and conventions too.
I mean, there's a huge appetite for that sort of stuff. I mean, obviously, I mean, think of our time at Lord Wandsworth College. If anybody said, "What do you want to be?" I think most people now would say, "I want to be a Nick Pope," because they love your job description. What was it? You were in charge of the UFO project for the government, the UK government, for a couple. For how many years?
For 3 years. And now, while I was doing that, I had some other responsibilities too. I mean, ironically, as I've written books myself, one of the things I did in parallel with investigating and researching UFOs was that I had some responsibility for the NATO war books, updating them. But one of the other things, by an odd piece of irony, is that I was one of the people, it kind of goes back almost to fact checking. I was one of the people who was reading all these manuscripts that people, whether it's General Sir Peter de la Belliere or whether it's Chris Ryan or Andy McNabb, I was reading those books, and I was the person, or one of the people, with the black pen, saying, well, I think that might be classified. I think that might be sensitive. I'm not sure that's factually accurate. You had to be very careful not to rewrite someone's book for them. And there are all sorts of sort of legal and open government, freedom of information issues to factor in too. But I mean, the bread and butter of the job, the thing everyone wants to, no one wants to say, hey, Nick, what were the NATO war books like? When you take up ships from trade, what notice period do you give, and where do you pre-position them? No one wants to know that.
Well, let's ask those two questions. No, to set the record straight, I will answer both those two questions, then we'll move on to the other stuff. What's the answer to both of those?
The answer to that is I think it's probably completely classified, or more to the point, I can't remember whether it's classified or not. Therefore, I'd better assume that it is and not answer. And also, I genuinely can't remember. I mean, these NATO war books were huge volumes, and amendments would come in, and it was every conceivable aspect of the transition from peace to war, calling up the reserves, taking up ships from trade, pre-positioning all your stores, making sure the supply and logistics chain is intact, et cetera, et cetera. But I really can't remember the details of any of that. But obviously, going back to your question, what everyone wants to know is, come on, I mean, if I was told at school, going back to your question, what would you like to do as a career? Well, investigating UFOs for the government does have a kind of,
it's got to be up there. They all want it. All the pupils at Lord Wandsworth College, now our old school, would want to be Nick Pope. It is the dream job. But the interesting thing, though, Nick, I mean, you talk about language. The US had their own department, and they called it Project Blue Book. Now, why couldn't the British come up with something good?
I know. We didn't come up with anything at all.
Nothing at all. It does what it says on the tin. What was your bit called?
Exactly. So, well, depending on who you ask, I mean, sometimes you say UFO desk, sometimes you say UFO program, sometimes you say UFO project. I agree. I wanted to give it a name. I can't remember in the end why we didn't, but yes, the US had Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book most famously. So all we ended up with was a situation where, when talking to the media about this, you just had to use these does what it says on the tin things like UFO program. But I would have loved to have given it a. Unfortunately, in the US, in the UK, we tend not to give things sexy names anyway. Most code words come randomly off a a computer. So whereas the US has things like Operation Desert Storm, we in the UK called our contribution to that particular conflict Operation Granby.
Oh,
And
yes, it's not the
the
same, is it?
Falklands.
You need to
No,
get and all those creative juices. And Merriman, our wonderful English teacher, would have said, "Exercise your creative juices, Nick. You've got to make this make sense." And you would have come up with something sexy. What would have been the sexy title for what you did?
well, I think something like Operation. I'd give it a I don't know, planet name, or Operation Galaxy.
Operation Exploring
Something
Uranus. They got all of these.
yes. But you know, there's a great story in one of the, I think it was a humanitarian aid op. Chief of the defense staff one day said, right, okay, we're going in to give some humanitarian aid, do some peacekeeping. Something came out of the computer randomly selected, and he said, I've had enough of this. He said, I want something more purposeful. And so it got called Operation Purposeful.
Oh, there
But
you go.
I think yeah, so it can be done. It can be done, but it takes someone at kind of, top of the tree to do it. And I was just middle ranking bureaucrat. So
So when they first approached you, I mean, talk to me about that. I mean, how does somebody say, right, we want to set up this particular department, and by the way, Nick, we'd like you to be involved. How did that come about?
Well, it actually had been set up since 1953. And indeed, we had reports that went back further than that, even to the Second World War. Foo Fighters, before it was a name of a band, were small balls of light and metallic discs seen by pilots in the Second World War and assumed to be Axis secret weapons. After the war, it transpired that Axis pilots had seen similar things and assumed that it was some sort of Allied secret weapon. But up until 1953, these things were investigated really on an ad hoc case-by-case basis. But in 53, it was decided to formally constitute something, and a program was put together, and it was basically the brief was to investigate all sightings of anomalous objects or phenomena in the United Kingdom air defense region and ascertain whether there's evidence of any threat to the defense of the UK or anything of more general scientific or technical interest.
Okay, so that was the brief, a fantastic brief. You had lots, and sort of around the time, most famously sort of quoted thing was around the time that we were both at Lord Wandsworth College, which was about Rendlesham Forest. Because I think that was in 1980, wasn't it? December 1980.
Yes, this is sometimes even called Britain's Roswell. And
there you go.
This was, I mean, it wasn't a crash, but something was witnessed to have landed. And now, again, interestingly, going back to what we were talking about fact-checking and things, don't just take my word for it. The Ministry of Defense file on this has been declassified and released, and it's available online, free at the moment because of the lockdown, at the National Archives. And it tells this story of how over a series of 3 nights, multiple military witnesses saw this object. On the first night, some of them saw it land. Subsequently, they examined the site. They found indentations. They found burn marks, scorch marks on some of the trees. They assessed the radioactivity levels with a Geiger counter. And there's a document where the scientific and technical intelligence specialists in the MOD's defense intelligence staff say that the levels of radioactivity recorded seem significantly higher than the average background. And that's a direct quote from the government document. That's, as I say, now the file's been declassified and released. The UFO was briefly tracked on radar. On the 3rd night of activity, the witnesses included the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Holt.
And he was a real skeptic, wasn't he? He said, "Oh, this will never happen." And he was the one who got persuaded.
He said, "I think this is nonsense. I think all these rumors about UFOs. It's interfering with the primary mission of the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. These were United States Air Force bases on UK soil. And then when somebody burst into this award ceremony that he was co-hosting and said, "Sir, it's back," and he said, "What's back?" And he was told that the UFO had returned, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to put an end to this nonsense for once and for all." And he went out, as he put it, to debunk all this, put it to bed. But he ended up witnessing a UFO himself. And at one point, he said, and he had a team of about 6 people with him. And I think I've spoken to 4 or 5 of those people personally now myself. I did a cold case review at the MOD, and subsequently in some of the journalism that I've done, and I've dived back into this case. So I've spoken to most of those people, and Colonel Holt describes how at one point a narrow beam of light fired down from the UFO at just in front of him, and looking back on this, he's asked himself the question, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was this communication? What was it? And he doesn't know. This case, I mean, literally, this coming December will be the 40th anniversary. And yet, it's still a mystery to this day. All sorts of theories out there, aliens, time travelers, misidentifications, hoaxes, but no definitive, final, absolutely, this can be proven, this is what it was. We don't know.
And that's the extraordinary thing about it. I mean, we were saying, and we always say, you and I are ad idem, a bit more Latin for us, everybody. We are ad idem on the fact that you have to question everything. You have to get lots of different sources for stories, flick through the channels, because the truth is out there between that sort of side. It's not the race to be first. Let's get the truth and make sure that happens. One of the most persuasive witnesses in any case is a skeptic who converts.
Yes, and Colonel Holt is absolutely the epitome of that. He had no prior interest in this subject. He had no belief. He was a very sort of down the line, by the book, senior military officer, no nonsense sort of person. And yet here he is, thrust into this situation, and he has told me on many occasions afterwards that he really actually wished that the whole thing hadn't happened. I mean, people might say, "Oh, but he's been on TV," and well, so what? I mean, he retired as a full colonel. I think his final posting was as one of the inspector generals in the Pentagon. I don't know whether he would have actually got his star had he decided to stay in or not. But even setting that aside, he really wished the whole thing didn't happen. When he was told that under the Freedom of Information Act, journalists had gotten hold of some of this and they were going to have to declassify and publish the memo with his name on it, he knew the guy handling the Freedom of Information request, and he was a friend, and he said, "Pete, I'm begging you, burn the darn thing." And he said, "Sir, Chuck, I think they were the same rank." He said, I can't do that." And he said, "Oh no, my life is not going to be the same again." And sure, he's been on TV a few times, mainly to set the record straight, and he's spoken at the odd conference, but that's not really who he is or what he's about. And these sorts of people, they're not getting rich off it. They'll probably get if they do a TV interview, they'll get a couple of $100 for expenses, just about cover your costs. I mean, he's got his full colonel pension and worked after that too, so he doesn't need that couple of $100 from the TV company or whatever. So for all the people that say, "Oh, these people are just in it for the money or the attention," no, he'd really rather that it hadn't happened. And many of the witnesses I've come across with Rendlesham, and indeed a whole bunch of other cases that you haven't heard about precisely because people haven't got hold of it, for example, through freedom of information, or they haven't tracked down the name of the witnesses. So many of these people stay silent.
And it is interesting, as I say, that to me adds to the credibility of the story. As you say, when anybody tells me anything, you always say, well, why are they telling you this? Is that what is their potential interest? Whether there's a company interest, whether there's a government interest, whether there's an interest because they get a bit more money, if it's a bit more sensational. When you get somebody who is a skeptic, there's not much money, and he'd rather not tell the story, that adds to the credibility, doesn't it?
It does, and again with Rendlesham in mind, for the number of witnesses that are on the record, there are still a number of them that say, no, don't want anything to do with this. Yes, I saw something, but no, I'm not going on the record. Same with what's going on in the United States right now with these US Navy sightings. We have, for example, I think there are about 6 pilots and radar operators and other former, actually, I think a couple of them were still in the service, which is very interesting, but mainly retired Navy people on the record. And we have these 3 videos taken with forward-looking infrared camera. And yet the US Navy last year said that they had issued guidance to their personnel instructing them what to do if they encounter these things. And they said that was in response to what they describe as a still ongoing series of multiple incursions into restricted military airspace by what we all in government call UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, but UFOs to the public. This was a term we actually coined in the MOD, or rather we adopted it. We didn't invent it, but we adopted it in the UK and the MOD in the early 90s, and it then found its way into the US government. But for the number of these incursions that we have, obviously we're talking about a large number of pilots who've had these encounters. But the number of them, I think the only one of the pilots involved, for example, in one of the original, this is the USS Nimitz and the so-called Tic Tac Incident. The only pilot that we have, I think, well, wait, there's 2. There's David Fravor, and I think there's Ryan Graves, and there's a couple of radar operators as well. But the wingman, or rather the wing person, she's still in the service, absolutely is not going on the record for now, and she's not alone with this. I mean, I know her name, but there is I think this view that particularly with people still in service, yes, the stigma is less than it was. I mean, we've now had the president go on the record and say he's had a meeting on this. We've had various senators in Congress, in the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, say that they've had classified briefings. But there's still a stigma to some degree. It's lessening, but there's still some degree of stigma. So a lot of these people are not speaking out. Firstly, they don't want the attention. Secondly, they are worried about adverse career implications. And secondly, there's no getting away from the fact that some people in the UFO community are just crazy, and they don't.
Absolutely.
They don't want to engage with that.
People love the sensational, and I think that, and it's very easy to dismiss the sensational as they're all lunatics, they're all crazy, therefore shut them up. So somebody who might have a story to tell is so worried, as you say, about that particular stigma. So you work on that sort of basis. What I love as well, though, Nick, is that both you and I were at Lord Wandsworth College at the time that Rendlesham broke. So I could technically say that I was working with Nick Pope at the time of Rendlesham, which I love, it's good. In the same way as Johnny Wilkinson, another Lord Wandsworth College boy, was basically in the rugby team. So I was in the same rugby team as Johnny Wilkinson, and also the same working together with Nick Pope during Rendlesham. I think the PR spin is superb, isn't it?
It is. Now, of course, we would then have to put our hands on our hearts and say that we never heard of Rendlesham, and indeed the story didn't break in the media until 3 years after that anyway, so it's not as if it made contemporary media. But yeah, the Johnny Wilkinson thing is great. Yes, the times didn't overlap, sadly,
Oh,
but
no,
I
I know
can
exactly. But
say,
never
yeah,
let the truth stand in the way of a good
yeah,
story. Well, this is where we came in, you know. It's working both
absolutely.
ways.
I can probably say, with hand on heart, that I have played rugby on the same pitch
There you go.
as Johnny Wilkinson.
And
Now,
probably with the same coach.
probably with the same coach. Now, not at the same time.
No, no,
And if I'm
that will
being,
come out in the edit,
yeah,
mate. But forget that bit. I want the
and
headline. This is good. You and I have
and
played on the same team as Johnny Wilkinson with the
and
same coach on
if
the same pitch.
if I'm being honest, though, I will say that I did not play quite as well as Johnny Wilkinson.
No, if I'm honest, I'll say I played much better. They just didn't discover the talent until later. It's kind of, you go. But that's what I love about school is you're turning around on that sort of basis. And we've all gone off with different career paths. And then several years later, we'll come back and say, look, here's the unifying element where we're all looking at how this crazy, crazy world is interpreting things. But you've got a common point of reference. And that common point of reference drives our own thoughts, if you like, as to how we should look at things. Because going back to what you said beforehand, is that you said this famously in many of the interviews that I've read about you and seen you on television, you keep an open mind.
Yes, I think one has to. Now, intellectually, I know, and the paper trail bears this out, that the vast majority of UFO cases that I investigated and that my predecessors and successors investigated had conventional explanations. These, unlike Rendlesham, where I was saying the case remains unresolved, but if you go into the declassified Ministry of Defense file, it's very obvious from most of them, it was very clear that we were dealing with aircraft lights, satellites, meteors, more recently, of course, things like Chinese lanterns. And the bread and butter of the job, sadly, despite this X-Files dynamic, but the bread and butter of the job, the day-to-day business, is simply taking the date, time, location, and description of the sighting, and we got about 200 or 300 reports each year, and you go to the big map on the wall, and you say, what's there? And you get the NOTAMs, the notices to airmen, and you say, right, is this on a flight path? Is it in a military exercise area? Was there a weather balloon launch? You reach out to the, that's another one. You reach out to the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, and you ask, excuse me, is there any astronomical phenomena that can explain any of this? Bright stars and planets, meteor showers, re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere of space debris. We could speak to the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Center at Fylingdales. Radar, whether it's the space tracking radar at Fylingdales or more conventional military radar, is a big part of any UFO investigation. And if you have them, of course, photographs and videos, we had access to UK intelligence community imagery analysis resources and capabilities, and you can then get to work on it and say, is it a fake? And if it's not, what do we think it is?
And for each one, I mean, as you say, there's a set routine that you go through. Here are the questions. Say, okay, so talk me through. I can imagine, based on what I've read and seen and heard you speak on this very eloquently several times, a report comes in of a UFO. I saw something. You go through your little checklist, big checklist. Is it this? Is it that? And everything else. Is that basically how it worked?
It is. Most of the reports came to us via phone calls. People would phone in and say, I've seen something. And then you had literally, this being the civil service, we had a form on which all the information was recorded. And this form, interestingly enough, was very closely based on Project Blue Book's
There
old
you go.
form. So
Fantastic.
the
What
old,
a wonderful title, the one you
yeah,
missed out on. You've got to be good.
absolutely. So the old United States Air Force Project Blue Book, we essentially copied not only their methodology, but even their paperwork. And yeah, absolutely. You would use this. You wouldn't necessarily interrupt, because sometimes when you're interviewing people, it's best to get that narrative flow. But you would make sure that that narrative flow included all those key bits of information. And again, you can see the form for yourself in the files, of course, many times filled in. It's the date and time and location of the sighting. Then it's a description of the object, an estimation of the angle of elevation. Most people would give you an estimated height. Conventional wisdom was that people are not very good at estimating heights, better at estimating angles of elevation, but inevitably you would end up with both. And sometimes, of course, with a military witness, you'd get someone who said, oh, I know what a cloud base at 1,500 feet looks like, and this object was, I think, about 500 feet. And you'd take that. Then you would, did the object make a sound? Was the movement constant or was it erratic? That's very important, because particularly with nighttime sightings, obviously a lot of things attributable to things like satellites and meteors. So if you suddenly have a description of an object making a sudden erratic right angle turn, that takes a lot of things off the table, assuming the witness is firstly being truthful, and secondly is assessing what they saw accurately, which is not a given, but it's there are degrees with all of this. Most of the witnesses were we assessed truthful, well-intentioned, recollecting to the best of their ability what they saw and perceived. So yeah, we would go through the form, record all this information, and then, as I say, start trying to correlate it with things we either knew about or could find out about: flight paths and times, military exercises, weather balloon launches, satellites, meteors. The list goes on and on. And one by one, most of these sightings, you were able to eliminate them with a high degree of confidence. White light, red-green lights on either side, seen in vicinity of Heathrow, probably an aircraft. Now, obviously, never say never, and there's always a percentage game to be played, but you can play the odds with those sorts of things.
Yeah, and as you say, the great thing is you keep an open mind. But if there is an explanation there, then that's what you're looking for, and you are, in the same way as a lawyer would approach his witness. You're drilling down, saying, look, here's the formula. If it's one of these, it's got an explanation. But I also know, as you may know, I'm a member of the inner magic circle. So we know there's certain things that you can manipulate the mind, you can manipulate the memories, you can make people recall that actually this suddenly appeared in a puff of smoke and it was just there. There's little elements of the journey that people will forget. People like Darren Brown are masters of this, because that's what happened. So sometimes people read what should have happened, and then they will introduce that to the evidence they already have.
That's absolutely correct. And sometimes what you'll find a number of different things going on. Sometimes you will find that people report, well, yeah, pretty much as you say, what they expected probably happened rather than what did happen. And I, funnily enough, just before I joined the UFO program, one of my other jobs included having responsibility for parliamentary aspects of Royal Air Force aircraft accidents. And one of the things that we learned very quickly there was how unreliable witnesses are. And I found that again in a subsequent study that I was involved with, which involved my going out to Iraq and looking at some allegations and such like. about how unreliable witnesses are. Sometimes, perhaps because they have political agendas or maybe seeking compensation, but most times just because people are people with all their flaws, and they're not recording machines.
Absolutely. I would actually say that everybody is unreliable, because you're coming with things with your own prejudices. Everybody's open to influence, which is why advertising agencies and spin doctors and so on and so forth do so well. And it's understanding those prejudices and how you might be able to counteract it. So it's not just one person you get the evidence from, it's a number of others. And that's why some witnesses are more reliable. Nobody's 100% reliable, but some are more reliable than others. As you say, people who are experts, people who are dissenters beforehand and had that road to Damascus moment. Those are the people who add to the credibility, and they may be better witnesses than others, but never 100%.
Yes, completely agree. And one thing that I was taught to look for very quickly was somebody who had a fair degree of "I don't know" or "I can't recall" in their answers, because that tended to have that sense of realism about it, because real life's like that. And
Absolutely.
when I came across a witness who had an answer for absolutely everything, the alarm bells went off a little bit more than they did where somebody would pause and they would think for a little and they would say, "Well, you know what, I'm not sure."
Yeah, it's an old lawyer's trick. You ask somebody to recall something which is in a case which might, an accident might, or an incident might have happened several months, sometimes a few years ago, yet you ask them what they had for breakfast and they still don't know. So the reality is you can twist this, you can twist their words, you can twist what happens, you can twist the narrative. And people are human. And what happens is people forget. And people also have that ability. And again, it's fascinating about evidence. People have the ability that they want to please. So they want to try and tell you, if you're an expert in a white coat and a clipboard, and you don't want to waste their time, and they're asking you about, okay, we're here with the UFO department because we couldn't think of Project Blue or whatever as a name. What sort of evidence do you want to hear? Well, maybe we can give you that sort of story so we haven't wasted your time.
Sure, and then there are cultural factors as well. I mean, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, like Iraq, if something happens and somebody turns up, everyone will say they've seen it because everyone wants to be a part of it. And very often, you take a longer view and you look for the old guy smoking on the steps who hasn't come up. And then you go over to them when all the excitable people have come up and told you what just went down. And you go over and you say, "Did you see something?" And he'll say, "Actually, yes, I did."
It depends what he's been smoking, I guess. But yes, you're absolutely right on that. No, but it is, and it's so important. This is why, as I say, as Jimmy Wells said, it's evidence-based journalism. That's what you're doing. And if you're working on that principle, when you're looking and you're doing a scientific approach to the question, so you haven't got your own prejudices, and people will ask you, do you believe in aliens or what? And you can just say, well, I don't know. You know, we work on that basis. I think there's an arrogance about people who are so extreme, nothing will shift their views. And this is, even politically now, you always get both sides of both camps. You turn around, the people who just turn around and say, it will never happen, and those who say it's happened all the time. And the people who persuade are the ones in the middle. And it happens in elections when you're talking about gathering data and so on and so forth. You don't worry about the people you've already got. You don't worry about the people you'll never get. What you care about the people in the middle, and how can you persuade them?
Yes, and intriguingly, one finds that in the UFO community too. One finds that it's a community with a belief spectrum, and at both ends, the outer edges of that spectrum, there is a sort of die-hard certainty, an arrogant extremism. So you get the true believers who not interested in evidence because they know, and very often they have a narrative where the government knows all about this. We've got a spaceship hidden away in a hangar somewhere. Somebody like myself is disinformation agent or still secretly working for them, or both, and it's a done deal. Aliens are here. At the other end, one gets an equally sort of arrogant, I'm not interested in evidence, sort of assumption, it can't be, so it isn't. And you know, whether it's, and the irony again, as with, I suppose, Bolshevism and National Socialism, extreme left and extreme right, they have far more in common with each other in the UFO field. The true believers and the diehard debunkers have far more in common with each other than they do with the sort of center mass of people in the middle who say, well, you know, I'm not sure, I'm inclined towards this, I'm inclined towards that. And then you mentioned something interesting, actually. You mentioned UFO research in a scientific methodology. I'm going to be a little controversial and say it's actually more of a police methodology. You identify and interview witnesses, you locate and analyze evidence, whether it's photographs, videos, radar tapes, and then I'll go even further as to use the legal analogy. And with UFOs, when one gets this all the time, is if you're talking about the possibility, could any of this be extraterrestrial? Should we apply with some of these cases the beyond reasonable doubt model, or should we apply the on the balance of probability test?
You know,
and I don't have an answer for that.
Isn't it? Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And this is why I like the idea of interviews being conducted by lawyers. I said to you earlier that as a lawyer, you're a paid mouthpiece. You're not taking sides. You're not supposed to take sides other than your clients. And your client pays you, not necessarily to find out the truth, but to represent their case in the best way. And you will then question people who may have an absolutely accurate account as far as they're concerned. You're there to put doubt into their story. And there are tactics that you use that you can ensure that you sow those seeds of doubt. And it's when you do that, and this is why I love investigative journalism, which is done well. That's the best form of journalism. And we talked earlier about don't lose that side. Even if the citizen journalisms that we've got, that's fantastic. Everybody's a reporter now. But we have to make sure that we question everything, question it forensically, work out it's only one version of the truth. So when you're getting the witnesses, you're looking at that, talking about their prejudices. You're talking about, okay, why might they be saying that? But also, if you want to look at it the other way, you can manipulate what's being said in order to fulfill your own agenda. And I think that's why it's so good that you've had all of this experience, and yet you've still got an open mind.
Yes, I always tried to avoid the leading question, for example, which is something that one sees in law, but also earlier in the chain, of course, one sees it in the police, who, again, with a lot of the cases, obviously, they're pretty sure they've got their person. They want to put them under pressure, and they want to build a case which will go to the Crown Prosecution Service, or the prosecutor, or the district attorney, or whatever. So at every step, it does come back to, is there an agenda here? And if so, what is that agenda and how is it manifesting? And is anyone really, truly impartial? Now, you could say, I mean, I mentioned earlier, for example, as one of the examples of possibly one of the most impressive pieces of investigative journalism in recent memory, the Boston Globe Spotlight team. And the pedophile priests. But even there, one can say, yes, they turned out to be right, but even the investigative journalists would far rather that they're onto something, and there's a story here, than dig and, oh, you know what, actually, there's nothing to this. So even there, now, they obviously, I hope that most people would be honest enough when they hit that point that they would say, there is nothing to this. I think there's a whole bunch of people making stuff up, maybe for compensation, maybe for attention seeking. But everyone's got an agenda. It's just finding out what that agenda is and then trying to factor that in and deal with it. I mean, I've seen, in going back to the UFO field, if you look at the whole alien abduction mystery, which I almost consider almost a subset of the more general UFO phenomenon. So much of this comes out under regression hypnosis, which has all sorts of problems in terms of no one's entirely sure what the nature of the hypnotic state is. Is it an altered state of consciousness, or is it just a very focused state of mind? Can it really help recover lost memories, or, as some psychologists and psychiatrists believe, can it scramble memories and even implant false ones, particularly if you're dealing with an investigator who's not entirely impartial? And the trouble with the UFO community is that many times people who were doing these regression hypnosis sessions were UFO investigators who were essentially trying to prove to the world that this was real. So you would get some terrible leading questions. I mean, I sat in on a couple of sessions, one in the UK, where somebody said, and the aliens did this, and the person, the hypnotherapist nodded his head and said, yes, they tend to do that. And it's just staggering.
Yeah, well, but actually, people say it's unbelievable. It's actually very believable, because what happens is people work backwards from the story. It's what we said earlier, where you touch on and say, okay, what's the story? Now I need to find evidence to support that story. And the reality is now the world is full of evidence that can support any view. And as you know, I've also been involved in hypnosis. I've looked at a lot of, I've represented and worked with some of the best hypnotists in the world. And it is an altered state of mind, but you can implant certain suggestions that you believe something is real. If you turn around and say you're in a cage full of lions and you see a lion that's going to reach up to you, and you're in that state, you're going to go like that and you'll be scared and you have the same fear as though you'd seen a lion. When somebody comes round and say, what did you see? Well, there was this lion and everything else. They will act as though they genuinely believed it. And so you're right. When you're asking those questions, you have to be so careful and understand how people can be manipulated. And this is why the magic community and the magic circle in particular turn around and you look about these false mediums, whatever your beliefs. There are some people who are preying on the vulnerable. They are preying on the vulnerable, and that is despicable. I'm open-minded about all sorts of things, but there are definitely people who have been using fraudulent means to extract money from people. And
yes,
that is a very, very dangerous thing, isn't it?
Completely. Sometimes it is literally a magic trick, or it's a cheat. There's a recording device or some cheat like that. Oftentimes it's just cold reading people. Absolutely. and just the common sense. If somebody goes to see a medium or a psychic, usually they are going for one of two or three reasons, but very often it's a bereavement. And full well sometimes it's somebody who's seeking some sort of reassurance that life goes on and that they didn't suffer and that they're in a better place and that they'll be reunited again. And so, of course, through skillful cold reading, but also just through playing the odds, the medium will figure out, or the psychic will figure out, is this a bereavement case? Is it somebody who's coming for one of the other big reasons, of course, looking for love, who when will I find my soulmate? Is this the right person? And then, of course, you fall back on that other technique of telling people what they want to hear.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it is brutal.
But again, it's educating the public on that sort of thing. You may remember we used to have this village fete in the days of Lord Wandsworth College. We used to have a village fete, and one year, I think I was Madame Zaza, and they put me in this little tent, and I had a little globe so I could do my mystic ball thing. But I understood how it works. You give a lot of Barnum statements, which apply to everybody basically, and you can read them. And what you do, you very carefully repeat back the information that people give you. Simple things. If somebody's wearing a wedding ring and they're there and they're lonely, they're married. If they're dressed a certain way, all the cues that you get, body language, people give away so much information. and they don't know they're doing it. So I could, in the same way as lots of members of the Magic Circle could, we could replicate what a lot of these psychics are claiming to do. What a lot of the people who are hypnotists will be able to enable people to have a very vivid memory. They're absolutely certain it happened because we've got ways of manipulating that memory. In the same way, combine that with legal skills and how you can weave a particular story for a jury, and you've got it made, haven't you?
Completely. And I have to say, that is a spooky blast from the past, because I'm pretty sure that maybe it was a year or two after you, I too was Madame Zaza.
No! Did you take my shoes, my spangled shoes? Glorious!
And I realize I'm probably going to start all sorts of bizarre conspiracy theories here, but yes, I was the mysterious Madame Zaza
and that's
myself.
what happened. And because the power that we had, I passed on that power to you, and I think I did it psychically. A little bit of telekinesis was happening there as well. How is it? So you were Madame Zaza? I didn't know that. How did you get on?
Yes. I really can't remember much about it, but yeah, I think, well, that really is a mysterious, spooky blast from the past that we have that in common too.
It was so fun. But I'll tell you what happened, Nick, there, because we interviewed lots of people afterwards about how accurate it was. It was a social experiment for me. I was a kid, you know, I was 17, and that sort of, you would have been similar sort of age when you were doing Madame Zaza. And you go and ask them afterwards how accurate it was. And most of them will give an extraordinarily high percentage, which is my point about how people recollect how accurate it is and how convincing they can convince themselves. So it's not saying they're lying necessarily, because people genuinely believe something happened. And so when you're interviewing people about experiences and things like that, they're not lying to you. It's not that sort of, it's not out of any malicious purpose. It's not out of money or anything else. They've got a story to tell, but it's a story that already could be manipulated because of the prejudices they've got, but it also could be manipulated because they want to please. It could also be manipulated because people have sown so many seeds in there that they're regurgitating somebody else's version of an event.
Yes, and I think sometimes, going back to the psychics and the mediums, they'll throw a lot out there, sometimes quite rapid fire. Oh, there's a cat. Oh, there's a lost household object. Oh, there's an argument. And some of this is very kind of broad stuff. I mean, my goodness, I see a family argument. Well,
I see a scar on your left knee, I think, Nick. I think, didn't you used to be Madame Zaza? I've got that feeling. I see crystal balls of your past.
But what then happens, and this ties in with what you were talking about, interviewing people afterwards, people remember the hits and not the misses.
Absolutely.
Oh, there was something about a cat. Yes, we had a cat once. Or there was something about a lost item. Gosh, I remember that time when I lost my keys and they turned up in the pot on the mantelpiece. And you come away and you don't even remember sometimes all the things that were just casually thrown in, and then they kind of walked it back. Something to do with the car. No, there was nothing to do with the car. No, something to do with the accident. No, there was nothing.
And I think, and that's the way to do it, because scientifically, and we've done this. You can record things, and you say, okay, we'll record it verbatim, exactly what's happened, what was said, and when, and we'll ask people just to recount what's happened. It's the example I gave you beforehand about a magic trick. And people will just say, okay, he was in a box here, and then he appeared over here, and nothing happened in between. And maybe the little bit in between is the bit we want you to forget, but what's happening is you remember the before, the after, and the hit. And that's because we can manipulate the journey. And it's manipulating the journey which has a powerful impact on why there are the psychology of conspiracy theories, which we'll come on to, which I think there should be more of a study. I know they've looked at it in certain places. In Miami, I think they started to look at it. In Cambridge, they started to look at it. Much more research can be done as to why they spread, why people there's a hunger for conspiracy theories, whether we're powerless or whatever it is, whether there's the fear of governments, whether there's the fear which you spoke about being the most powerful tool. All of that will enable people in this era where data is the new currency. The more we know about people, the easier it is to manipulate them.
Yes, big data, big information. People, I think, I've seen some great investigative journalist pieces on this. People are absolutely staggered when they do a deep dive into how much information about themselves they can find out there. And of course, so it's no wonder that this can be abused in things like identity theft. But people post so much about themselves, and even in the world of intelligence, for example, people talk about satellite intelligence, electronic intelligence, but the real growth branch is the what can you just harvest from all the open sources that there are, whether it's building up a case file on an individual, or whether it's researching a corporation, or finding out something about a new aircraft or tank. Staggering what there is out there.
Oh, and it's shocking, and it always amazed me why people were so obsessed with. There was this whole thing about people having to carry an identity card at one stage. You remember that sort of no idea, I want to be an individual, nobody's allowed to know anybody. But at the same time, the amount of information which they track everybody, cameras everywhere, so we know where you're moving. You've got these loyalty cards which tell you what you're buying. You've got your credit cards. You've got your mobile phone which can pinpoint your location. And all the time you're going on social media, filling in these quizzes about what sort of pop groups you like, what's your favorite color, and all the information people are giving out. If they realize to what extent that information could be used, I think they'd stop and think about it, wouldn't they?
They should, certainly, but you seldom see the big picture. So it's because everything's so compartmentalized that this works. And you think, well, what's the harm in posting a picture of my cat on Facebook? What's the harm in tweeting that I've just gone to this great pizzeria? And then what's the consequence of doing this? And individually, very little or nothing. But holistically, when particularly either skilled individuals, sometimes with bad intent, sometimes just with commercial intent, or in the future, increasingly, AI, big data, big information, is going to be able to take this instantly and build up a profile that at the kind of benign end of the spectrum, you'll just get really, really targeted ads, which will be right up your street. And, maybe that's a good thing, or not necessarily a bad thing. But that kind of dossier on individuals is something George Orwell probably would be smiling wryly about if
absolutely. He predicted it's totally the days we were at Lord Wandsworth College. It was totally 1984, isn't it? Because what happens is now insurance companies can predict how likely you are to die, probably quicker than your medical professionals, because they've got data and they're basing that data. And the more information that's gathered, the more accurate the predictions can be.
Yes, and we're now moving into, so you get all these companies that will take your DNA and supposedly, though it's not quite as simple as that, but tell you, 14% of your genetic background and heritage is in the Scottish Highlands, and there's a little bit down in Hungary, or there's up over in Finland, and all that. But then it's very easy to see how then, going back to the point that the medical profession will have, whatever you think about its reliability, but it will have data on, say, genetic predisposition to certain diseases, and then you'll get not just this dossier, but you'll get this dossier that brings in genetics as well as other factors. And as I say, at the benign end of the spectrum, if you're a pizza fan, you'll get pizza ads. But at the more malevolent end of the spectrum, well, you'll get things like identity theft, but you will get perhaps discriminated against on the basis of things which may not even be true. They just may be statistical constructs.
Lies, damn lies, and statistics. But what happens, it is such powerful information. It is shaping governments around the world. And this is what I was saying beforehand about Cambridge Analytica, and we get the two extremes. And we've looked at this. It's people are opening the kimono just a little bit so people understand it. But you will go, if you're a political party, if you want to get elected, what you do is you work out with those people are going to vote for me anyway, is what we said beforehand. Those will never vote for me. These undecided people, they're the ones I want to focus on. Those are people, some of whom may not have voted ever before. So what I want to do is I want to find out how I can influence them. And the way you can find out is get the data from social media that they do, and so on and so forth. And this has become more and more public. Cambridge Analytica is a good example. What happened with Cummings and the revelations about how the whole Brexit thing was engineered, if you like, and how both sides try to win the hearts and minds with different sort of methods. That sort of stuff is now becoming part of the narrative, and people are beginning to understand more about how things operate in reality.
And yet there's the big problem with this is that if this was really super reliable, you might say, well, if you have a genetic predisposition for this particular condition, maybe an insurance company shouldn't insure you, or maybe your premium should be higher. But people assume that all of this is right. And here's a classic example of why it isn't right. We're not there yet. If all of this was right, if it was possible to do all of these things accurately, you would think that on something as fairly major and fundamental and binary as the US presidential election, that they would have called it right. And yet almost every single political commentator called it wrong last time around.
And there was one person, this is why I won a notable amount of money off the head of a major news network, where because of the reasons and the various things that we called, I called the results of the general election when all the pollsters got it wrong. I called the rise of Trump when all the people got it wrong. And I did that on several levels. First of all, they were saying he was never going to get nominated, never get the nomination, won money on that. I said, and then we got it on, he's going to get the election, because people dismiss it. And one of the theories I have is that the reason the pollsters got it wrong is because if you ask somebody for a view which you know is going to be unpopular, you're going to give a different answer. So I wrote, and it's all documented out there, I wrote to expose all sorts of things. I say this is what's going to happen. And those predictions can come with alarming accuracy if you understand how to manipulate people. The lessons of history and how people follow certain patterns, it's a very, very powerful tool.
Well, some of this ties in with Neuro-Linguistic Programming, which I have come across, and some ties in with some work done in the intelligence community in what you would call a PSYOP, a psychological operation. And sometimes something as fundamental as the election can be miscalled for all sorts of reasons. And one of, I thought, the more astute comments that I saw the day after President Trump won the election was that quite a lot of the opinion pieces and columns was, all being written by journalists kind of filing their copy from Starbucks in places like Seattle and New York. And they kind of lost touch with what Middle America was doing or thinking. And it's back to that point about, but what about the people in the middle? Where are they? And people, I don't think the journalists had gone out into those small towns, or they hadn't gone out enough, talked to those people, and seen which way the wind was blowing.
No, absolutely. And it was totally Middle America who the values that they're using Trump as the example, the values that he was eloquently putting out there, for whatever your personal beliefs, it appeals to middle America who turn on, who have the fear of people taking their jobs, who have the fear of the message that we said beforehand. If you scare people about this, about the economy, people are going to rob your rights. If you put out enough rubbish, tell a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. You say things that you come out with the narrative about crooked Hillary and she's got all this sort of stuff, whether it's true or not true, whatever it is, people don't care what they do. They go for the headline, and it's that fear that it may be true that sways their opinion. And then what happens is, well, as you say, it's a spiral of deceit, if you like. What happens is people suddenly say, well, I've heard that. Well, so did I. And I heard that. And I heard that. And then all of a sudden you get this body of evidence supporting what could be a ludicrous suggestion.
Yes. I mean, classic self-fulfilling prophecies and things like that. And again, just people assuming, going back to the United States, people assuming that the United States is the big cities, and when it really isn't.
Yeah. And that's what we do forget, because you think about, well, how are we handling it in the UK? We talk about the current pandemic. How's it handled in the UK? Obviously, in the US, it's different. You've got it on a state-by-state basis. Trump will say what he says, but you'll get the different people doing it in their own way, aren't you? That's what you're getting.
Yes, it's a consequence of the federal system that we have in the US, that there really isn't a top-down government policy in the way that they say is in the US, and individual governors in individual states have a huge degree of power when it comes to, for example, deciding whether to lock down, when to lock down, when to reopen, and of course it looks kind of very higgledy-piggledy. But then you say, well, actually, a one-size-fits-all policy probably isn't that smart a play anyway. And if you look at the United States, for example, you say that, I don't have the figures in front of me, but fully, I think 50% of the cases are in New York, 43% of US cases, it's higher elsewhere, but 43% of US cases are in care homes. And if you take the percentage of people who are sort of, 70s and have comorbidity and are in a care home, one realizes, a little controversially, but statistically speaking, if you're not in those categories, yeah, you might catch it, but your chances of being seriously ill from it or killed from it are about zero.
And that's the reality, isn't it, Nick? Because what happens is people forget, and history will be the ultimate judge of this. We'll look back on this time and say, well, who got it right? And extraordinary measures that people are taking. But people don't know, and lots of questions which remain unanswered. And I say, I talk to people around the world about the different approaches. I've spoken to people in Australia and Zambia and all throughout Europe, and I was on the phone to Japan today talking about how they all deal with it. And it's all different. But time will tell. History will turn around and say, well, who got it right? And one of the things that the general question will be, did they die with it or from it? Is going to be the interesting thing. Is it about excess? How many people would normally die? I mean, it's horrible when we talk about it, because it's individual lives, and obviously our hearts and prayers go out to those who have been affected during this terrible time. But you then turn around and say, well, how many actually would normally be dying in this situation? What would the statistics be? How many more are there? And then you drill down into the demographic of those who've died from this terrible virus, as opposed to those who died with it. And you look at, and some of the people I've spoken to, they say, look, you've got a form in hospital where you tick what you die with. And it used to be, if somebody dies in hospital, invariably would be pneumonia, will be the final tick, even though that's what's happened, because that's the final thing they had, which finally saw them off. The reality is, I think a similar sort of thing might be happening with coronavirus. We're turning around, the statistics get skewed, don't they?
They do, and then there are so many other variables. I mean, simple, obvious ones like population size, population density, things like that. But other factors, like, for example, when we write the history on this, how do we tally up the deaths, say, of people who died of heart disease, cancer, and strokes, who wouldn't have died but for coronavirus because they thought, maybe with some justification, I'm not going to get checked out, or I'm going to ride this out. I'm not going to hospital. I'm not going to get treated. And I can't help. I'll make you a prediction.
Madame Zaza is going to go for it. Go on.
People are asking themselves, what are going to be the big issues after this? Is it going to be that we didn't have enough PPE or ventilators? Is it going to be that we didn't have enough testing? Is it going to be that we didn't throw enough at trying to find a vaccine? But one knows inevitably that probably a single issue will arise and will become the defining, I suppose, issue of the pandemic. Here's my prediction as to what it will be. I believe that 5 years on, people will say we should not have instigated crippling lockdowns of everyone, and we would have saved more lives if we had, and it's crashed economies, it's put millions out of work, it's set civil liberties back a generation. The financial cost of that, here's my point, if we had spent a fraction of the time and effort that we've spent on one size fits all, everyone's at risk, society-wide lockdowns, if we instead used those resources to help the people genuinely at serious risk, the elderly, comorbid, in care home people, by deep cleaning the care facilities, by enhanced shielding of the genuinely vulnerable, then A, we would have saved more lives, and B, we wouldn't have crashed economies, cost trillions of dollars, put millions out of work, and set civil liberties and freedoms back a generation by introducing things that even Stalin would have struggled to get on the books.
And I think there'll be a degree of accuracy in that, Nick. And I think that the reality is this: is that when history, they always say that hindsight is the best predictor. You work on that sort of basis, and undoubtedly, people have got a number of things wrong. They will blame the scientists because they just say, "Oh, we're only politicians. We're in the business of getting re-elected. So I'll talk to the scientists, and this is what the science tells us. This is the perfect narrative." They'll get the communication wrong, which is we've had this whole narrative over here where it started with "stay at home," and now it became "stay alert," whatever that means. The whole narrative is wrong. But when people talk about the health of the nation, it's not just the physical health, but it is the wealth in your pocket, because the two are interrelated. And I think the difficulty is, you're right, if you shut things down, people panic, that fear sets in. A&E has never been quieter for I don't know when. You hear doctors and nurses who I've spoken to turn around and say, people are not coming in. And they should be coming in because they need to see us for the illnesses which are going to kill them if they don't see us. So your point on that is absolutely right. At the same time, to balance it, I've also been speaking to people who don't fit into the stereotype. Those who are physically very, very healthy and have been struck with no underlying conditions, who have been struck down by this and will tell you how awful it was for them. So any evidence-based system, as you say, we need to look at all of those and explain the differences whilst also looking at the general pattern. The other thing, and the point that I make about this, about history and history repeating itself, is we should look at what happened with previous pandemics. It's not the first time in history. We've had loads of them. You go all the way back to the wrongly named Spanish flu of 1918, and you say, well, what happened there? We had lockdown. The most deaths happened after people came out. So the second wave, when people released or eased the restrictions, that's when the most deaths happened. because they were suddenly exposed
Hmm.
again. And people then say, well, how did they get rid of it? Because they didn't have vaccines. Well, it just died, it just fizzled out, and then life got back to normal. So these swine-based, virus-based, animal-based, zoo-based, they all have these glorious sort of names, viruses have been going on for generations. And you go even the way back to the Black Plague and the bubonic plague, our good history lessons at Lord Wandsworth College. They will tell you that the misinformation and things like that, where they try to work out why do people die? They died because of wrong information. The first bit of fake news, if you like, is people believed it came from the cats. So they killed the cats. And actually, because it came from the rats, it got worse because there were no cats to kill the cats. No rats killed by the
Yeah.
cats. So that sort of misinformation is extraordinary. So history
One,
repeating itself, getting the facts, looking at that sort of stuff, I think that's where the real lessons have to be learned, don't they?
they do, and I'm glad you used the phrase lessons learned, because I think there will inevitably have to be a cabinet office led cross-departmental review of this. And I think it's going to have to be done. It's a tricky one. It's going to have to be done quickly enough that lessons can genuinely be learned, but it's going to have to, because some of the data will take time to sort out. Like, for example, the point I mentioned about how do you factor in the extra deaths from heart disease, cancer, and strokes that will result from this, but arguably indirectly. But all this will have to be considered. And the other thing that people will have to consider is leadership. Part of leadership, I mean, all too often in this, people have fallen back on phrases like, I follow the science. We must be science-led with this. And that's fine. But leaders have to do more than that. A leader has to take the scientific advice, but also the economic advice, and some of the more indirect points, again, like I mentioned, the heart disease and the strokes and the cancers, and has to weigh all of this and say, with this review, did we panic? Did we get bounced into a decision because we thought something, it's the old classic, something should be done. It's easy to say we should do something. People are dying. Go and ask a medic, do you think there's any benefit would it save any lives if we shut down all of society? Well, yeah, I guess so. Well, we better shut down. And you get, it builds up at this head of steam, and it's driven by panic and hysteria and scare stories in the media, back to if it bleeds, it leads, fear sells. All of this plays into each other. All these points are interconnected, but there's going to have to be this cabinet office led cross-departmental review, and it's going to be very interesting to see who they get to chair that and what the terms of reference are, and of course what it ends up concluding.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think it's not just cross-departmental. I think it should be across the world, to be honest. I think if the global community said, let's compare our notes, we've all approached it slightly differently. And as they say, I've spoken to people on the ground, several people on the ground for their version of events, in the same way as you would talk to lots of different people. And they've all done it slightly differently. Who got it right? What did they learn from what they did? What would they do differently based on that information? We should, as a community, as a global community, get together and compare those notes.
Yes, being mindful of the differences, and some of them are cultural differences in terms of hygiene and cleanliness and social distancing, and so, I mean, just for example, the difference between a culture that shakes hands and a culture that bows respectfully to one another, and there's been a lot of debate about how the handshake may be a thing of the past. I know from my own government career, not the UFO side of it, but some of the other stuff, that presentational issues are critical to this. And a simple message is often not just better on the obvious term, but it's more effective. And sometimes if you ask yourself at the beginning, what should be the key messages. One of the ultimate ironies is that the US government probably had it right, as did, I think, the UK, with some of the initial advice, which basically said, if you are sick, stay home, stay away from people who look sick, wash your hands frequently, and try not to touch your face, particularly your mouth, nose, and eyes. And those are simple messages. But now we've got drawn into a much more complex. I mean, I don't know whether I should describe the UK's lockdown and subsequent sort of post-lockdown emergence as Stalin-esque, or maybe it's more accurate to say Kafka-esque. And you know, the idea of sort of social distancing police, and are you know, is a social gathering of 12 okay, but 13 somehow tips you into Armageddon, and but a protest's okay, as long as you maybe wear a mask, or if you know, and it all just sows confusion, and it's an absolute gift to the conspiracy theorists, because they'll say something's going on, and something is going on, but it's just not what they think. What's going on is panic, hysteria, confusion, and bureaucracy.
Absolutely, and you talk about conspiracy theories. You're absolutely right. What's happening? It is a gift, because people turn around and say, "You've got evidence." What we started with, we've got evidence to support any case. And you turn around and say, "Our government wants to take away our civil liberties." What better way of doing it than to invent this virus and blame the Chinese? This is what's going to happen. Or somebody wants to sell some software, or somebody wants to sell a vaccine, and therefore this is their motive for doing it. And again, it bases on fear. You can understand how the conspiracy theorists start to get credibility with people who want an explanation as to things which they don't currently understand.
And this is where, obviously, through the UFO work that I did for the British government, I've gotten drawn into this whole subject of conspiracy theories, and I write about it and commentate about it from time to time in the media, whether it's JFK or the moon landings or 9/11 or UFOs, of course. But I've written on all of that and more besides. And yeah, most of the conspiracy theories will turn out to be wrong, and they're motivated by and fueled by a number of interrelated things: fear and distrust of government and of authority, the belief that there must be a big, greater meaning to something. You know, oh, the most famous and beautiful woman in the world can't die of something as mundane as a car crash. There has to be some sinister Illuminati plot. And yet, when you drill down into it, one sees car driven at high speed, alcohol involved, people not wearing a seatbelt. People seem to forget that the one guy in the car who was wearing his seatbelt survived. But you know, we probably don't have time to talk about Princess Diana too much. But with coronavirus, yeah, most of what you hear is nonsense. And yet, Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, gave a recent interview, reported in the Telegraph and elsewhere, where he re-raised this issue of, well, maybe not deliberately, but somewhere in the line of all this, a Chinese laboratory may have played a part. And no, not as a deliberate release, not as a bioweapon, but he's thrown that out there based on a scientific paper. And President Trump, in one of his briefings, made a rather cryptic comment, and then refused to answer a follow-up by saying, well, obviously I'm not going to comment on what intelligence we have on China. So as with a lot of this, one should look for the things in the wider conspiracy that might actually either be true or have a grain of truth about them. Yes, we're talking about a zoonotic virus. Yes, it does seem to have come from the wet market in Wuhan, but how did it get there? And did it just come from poor hygiene and people having too close proximity with wild bats, or did a Chinese laboratory play a part? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't have access to the CIA China product and other intelligence products, but doubtless this will, the question isn't going to go away. Most of the rest of it is nonsense. I mean, I don't think anyone wanted to shut down any more than anyone in the United States wants to, quote, take our guns. But it was staggeringly easy to do that when you play on people's fear of arguably the most terrifying thing in the world, an enemy you can't see. And we're back to fear cells, and we're back to governments which, if they didn't create it, certainly didn't downplay the early vibe, which was everyone is at serious risk. You could like brush against someone on the underground and go home and get sick and die. And maybe one or two people did, but most people didn't. Most people were in the care homes with multiple pre-existing health problems, and the rest is history.
Yeah,
Or will
and
be.
as you said, it is history, and actually Hollywood. I mean, to talk about fact and fiction, and actually the two are now indistinguishable. If you look at a number of movies, for example, Contagion, I think it was 2011 with Matt Damon, it's exactly this story where a virus starts. Check it out if you haven't seen it. A virus starts in the wet markets in China. Somebody gets it, and all of the elements and all of the narrative about stay at home, wash your hands, touch your mouth, you're going to get it, social distancing, all those little buzzwords are in that movie. When you look at some bleachers, they say known to stop coronavirus. And you look at that, and that's been several years ago that was put on there, because this is not the first coronavirus we've had. The reason it's called COVID-19, as you know, is the 2019 version of it. And we've had it for a long time in history and so on and so forth. So if people want to see what happens where fact and fiction merge, the reality is you can, playing to people's fears, construct that sort of narrative. And that's going back to what you were saying when you were interviewing people, and they start to work on that sort of premise, that you turn around and say, well, what do people want to hear? Why are they saying it? And you will end up invariably with a small percentage, and it is small, that cannot be explained based on your flip chart of I'm ticking the box and so on and so forth. My question to you would be this, is of the percentage, I think it's probably what, 5% was it, that you couldn't really explain, maybe that sort of amount. How many do you believe are absolute concrete evidence that there is a UFO landed?
Well, it depends how you define UFO. If you
Of course.
define UFO as maybe including secret prototype aircraft or drone, then you would get some numbers on there. But if you ask me how many of those cases, of maybe the 12,000 cases that the MOD investigated in its time, how many were proven to be extraterrestrial spacecraft, the answer is very easy. The answer is 0. We do not have, notwithstanding what the conspiracy theorists say, we honestly do not have, to the best of my knowledge, a spaceship in a hangar somewhere. Nor do we have anything, even with these US Navy cases. We don't have a smoking gun that says this is definitely extraterrestrial. Somewhere in the United States government, there will be what's called the best current assessment of this. And that might say extraterrestrial, but it might not. It might say Russia, China, different part of our own government that we just can't get access to. So it's an easy answer. There are no cases that have been proven to be extraterrestrial visitation. It would take something, arguably, that kind of well, I suppose it would take an artifact that could be analyzed by multiple laboratories, independent from each other, different countries, and could be proven to have a technology that we don't possess. But even then, you'd be saying, well, maybe it's been developed somewhere by Elon Musk or some character like that, and someone's made a quantum leap. So in conjunction with that, you would need scientific techniques such as isotopic ratio analysis to prove that the material was literally, say, not of this earth. X-ray diffraction, you would get into those sorts of things. But until and unless you could do that and then have it authenticated, written up in peer-reviewed journals like Science or Nature, until you're at that point, and we're not, then my view is I can't rule out the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but it is just a hypothesis. It's not been proven.
Yeah.
I'd like it to be true.
That's what I was saying beforehand about Jimmy Wales sort of turning around and saying the news is broken and we can fix it. You get evidence-based journalists, and it does depend on how you frame the question. Because if I said to you, Nick Pope, you worked for the government for 21 years, you were part of the UFO section, which didn't have a sexy name like the Americans, but you're still part of it. You then turn around and there were a percentage, several cases, because you had 300 a year, several cases where there were unidentified flying objects because you couldn't identify them. That's true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Right, he confirms there's UFOs. And that's it, isn't it? If I ask the question, have you seen any evidence that there is extraterrestrial life, your answer would be what?
Well, I would say I've seen, it goes back, you'll correct me on the legal terms, I would say yes, perhaps I have seen evidence, but I have not seen definitive, beyond reasonable doubt proof. Now, I think you could say that into the evidence basket would go testimony, which after all, for all its flaws, I think you would agree that testimony is still at the heart of the criminal justice system. I saw this person do that thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's at the heart of it. Yes, for all the problems with eyewitness testimony, that is still where it begins. So we have that. But beyond that, how do you push it across the line? I'm not sure you do. I'm not sure you do.
I can ask you about your personal experience. I get that. There will be people for all the reasons that we've touched on, and really it's worth a wonderful debate. Maybe we'll explore it further at another time. But if I were to ask you, well, simple ones, have you ever seen an alien?
No.
Okay. No, and you're laughing, which is interesting. It's very good. Have you ever interviewed somebody who claims that they have seen an alien, and do you believe that they believe it?
Yes, but of course, my follow-up point is their belief may be mistaken. It may be a belief, and this plays back to things we've discussed, it may be that belief comes from regression hypnosis. It might come from an exceptionally vivid dream or hallucination or psychological condition. I don't think many of these people are lying. Yes, there's some hoaxing, proportionally less, I would say, with the Ministry of Defense than with, say, the civilian UFO groups, because they probably think we'd send the men in black round. But joking aside, most of the witnesses were well-intentioned, but mistaken. Yes, we absolutely had a number of cases that even after investigation, we couldn't explain in conventional terms. But of course, doesn't mean that the very next day, had we done one more round of checking, we might have stumbled across the answer. Or I mentioned earlier the police analogy of UFO investigation, and it's actually a very good one for another reason. An unsolved UFO case is rather like an unsolved crime. And yes, you might say at the end, unexplained, but unexplained does not mean it was an alien spacecraft. It just means you didn't get to the explanation. Alien spacecraft might turn out to be that explanation, but it might not. And so, like the unsolved crime, like the case file that sits in the local police station, the UFO case sits there. And unless some new witness comes forward, or some new piece of forensic, perhaps, evidence emerges, it is just going to be unsolved, unexplained, whatever you like. My personal view, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. Life out there, absolutely. Life visiting us down here, maybe. I don't know. I'd like to think so. It's a glib soundbite, but life, it would be a far more interesting world with aliens in it than not.
But I also had to agree with you, Nick. I think logically, I think we always say we have the same schooling, so we do know about these sort of things, and we would question everything. I have not seen any evidence that I can categorically say I've seen an alien. I've heard people who've claimed that. I haven't seen one myself. And the same about ghosts. I haven't seen a ghost, and therefore I can't categorically say they're a ghost. I'm open to all of it. I think it would be an arrogant and a wrong approach to say that we are the only planet in this billions of different planets that can have life on it. What form that life is, I don't know, but I think it would be arrogant for us to say we're the only planet with life. Is that fair?
Very much so. I mean, unless we thought there was something, and I use this word deliberately given our previous discussion, unless we thought there was something almost literally magic about Earth, I think we'll find that we're actually quite ordinary, and that there's nothing special about Earth. It's just a fairly ordinary rocky terrestrial planet orbiting a fairly standard kind of star. And the Copernican principle, the principle of mediocrity, you're probably going to be somewhere in the middle. We'll find that Earth isn't magic, and that if we're not special, then there's probably nothing particularly special about life. And again, we're unlikely, taking that Copernican principle, we're unlikely in the universe to be the first emerging civilization, and we're probably unlikely to be the last, and we're not going to be the most advanced, and we're not going to be the dumbest either. We'll probably be in the middle.
And I hope in my lifetime, I genuinely hope in my lifetime, that tourism on these other planets, tourism takes off, coupled with technology, that people are sufficiently curious that they would come over here and introduce themselves in a friendly way.
Well, I hope so. I mean, in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, even taking account of the fact that various heavy elements necessary for life were not present in the first cycle of star formation, but even taking that into account, in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, it's certainly conceivable that civilizations a billion years ahead of us might exist. And then when one thinks to terrestrial history of say, European explorers encountering indigenous peoples and the technology gap there, and whatever you think that gap was, and then you ask yourself what a technology gap of a billion years might look like. And we're back to the Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that may well be the place that we're in. And if that's the case, and if we're being visited, I sure as heck hope that they come here as scientists, as biologists, as anthropologists, and not as conquerors or exterminators, because with that kind of gap, frankly, Hollywood, be darned, there's nothing we could do about it.
No, you're absolutely right. So, of the big unsolved mystery, we've talked about Rendlesham, you mentioned Roswell. I mean, of those, which are the headline ones which we should be looking at, and are people still investigating them? What's the story with the unsolved ones?
Well, I suppose people are still talking about Roswell, nearly, well, over 70 years on. It's something crashed, but whether it's alien spacecraft or whether it's weather balloon carrying monitoring equipment that was studying high altitude atmospherics in relation to Soviet nuclear tests, we can't say. And there comes a point when the last living witness dies. When comes a point where these things pass from living memory into history and maybe into almost myth and legend, and it becomes, I mean, my goodness, you hear the phrase "the first 48," and it's a phrase that one uses in police investigations and indeed in UFO investigations. And I said until or unless a new piece of evidence comes forward, but frankly, with something like Roswell, 70 years plus in the past, it's difficult to conceive that, but maybe not impossible. If there was a crash retrieval, soldiers love souvenirs. Somebody puts something in their pocket, it sits on a mantelpiece for years. The grandchild digs it up and says, "What's this?" and makes a call, and wow. So yeah, don't take your eye off Roswell. It's still, whatever you think, it's still the kind of arguably the ground zero of a lot of this. So Roswell, Rendlesham Forest, the Phoenix Lights, that big case over the city of Phoenix, Arizona, in 1997. A handful of other classic cases, but you know, I don't know. Maybe it's like one of my little fantasies that if we ever do get a smoking gun, maybe it won't come from any of those kind of hallmark cases at all. Maybe it will be some tiny case that only generated 2 or 3 documents and no one outside the deep specialist community has ever heard of. But I think if you ask me the single question of what to keep your eye on, I would say this still unfolding story of the Pentagon's ATIP program, coupled with the ongoing US Navy revelations, and indeed the interest in all this that has been displayed in certain parts of the United States Congress with classified briefings. That's the one to watch.
And what do you predict will happen?
I think we will see more of the witnesses come forward, some of the other pilots and radar operators. I think we will see more films. We may see more documents. We know, for example, that in relation to a Freedom of Information Act request about the USS Nimitz Tic Tac incident, that there is, in parallel with the 3 videos that we've seen, which the DoD assures people are unclassified, in conjunction with that, an official response from I think it was US Naval Aviation Command. I may have that wrong. I don't have notes in front of me. We know that there's a secret video, and we know that there are some top secret briefing slides. Well, what's on those top secret briefing slides? Could that be declassified, or could it be possible to give people an unclassified summary of what's on those TS slides without, say, compromising things such as methods and sources of gathering intelligence? I don't know the answers to those questions, but in relation to what's more to come, that more documents, more videos, more classified briefings, and maybe some unclassified congressional hearings a little bit downstream, more of the witnesses going on the record, just more data, which will give us, even if it doesn't give us a definitive answer, it will take us closer to that answer.
Yes, and as what we said at the very beginning, it's all about evidence-based journalism, and the more evidence that we have, the more likely we are to reach an informed decision. And the problem is, without that evidence, we fill in the gaps based on our own prejudices and hopes. Sometimes, if we hope that there's extraterrestrial life, we're going to fill in the gaps accordingly. If we dismiss it, we'll simply dismiss the evidence as well. Talk to me very briefly about the alien autopsy. What are your views?
Oh, well, I mean, the film itself, I think, was a complete fabrication. I mean, for legal reasons, and I think there may even be some ongoing action on this, if only on the copyright side, but I still want to tread carefully. But I mean, I think the names of the various people involved, record producers, film producers, and indeed a professional magician in the mix, by the way. There's no doubt in my mind that the thing was just constructed. So, I mean, people don't ask the obvious question. It goes back to what you said about they start and then they work back. If a UFO crashed at Roswell or anywhere in 1947, the United States government would regard those extraterrestrials in much the same way as they would regard the astronauts. Intelligent, elite, and from a civilization that might be 1 billion years ahead. Do we really think it makes sense that someone would have said, let's cut them up? So people, I mean, even before we get to the obvious problems with the film itself, no one takes that step back and asks the obvious strategic questions about, well, what would government actually do if that had happened? And the answer is not cut them up.
Yeah, I personally know two of the characters who you mentioned, obviously the magician and also the producer, and I know they both have very strong views, and we'll talk to them publicly about that sort of stuff. And I know some of them are still out there, and a movie was made with Anton Deck. Do you remember Anton Deck?
Absolutely.
So, big stars on that sort of stuff, but very, very interesting. And just finally, because I'd love to get you, I could talk to you forever because we have such common interest, and apart from not seeing each other for like 40 years, can you believe it, apart from and discovering the Madame Zaza connection as well. Just finally on conspiracy theories, let me run through, I mean, my view, and it's consistent with all the stuff we've discussed. You know, people want desperately to explain things. They want desperately to confirm their own suspicions as to why certain things happen. You've worked with governments for a long time. You know how things operate. The conspiracy theories, and you're the subject yourself of conspiracy theories. They're all going to say, oh, no, you're deliberately there to put out the wrong information and mislead people. That's what they all say. Well, all of them, some of them say that. What's happening in that sort of way, if we run through some of the major conspiracy theories, I would welcome your personal views. And actually, I'll let you take the list. I would welcome your personal views on some of the big conspiracy theories throughout history, and just your headline commentary on that would be appreciated. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with JFK. I suspect an awful lot of people did want him dead, but I suspect that at the end of the day, Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Moon landings. Yes, we went, but I suspect that some of the film and photographs that came back were not as good as NASA hoped, and that some touching up and enhancement went ahead, and that this probably explains, in parallel with just a lack of scientific understanding about the environment, but that probably explains pretty much all the anomalies. Princess Diana, I've covered that one. I just think, you know, sadly, if this had been a car full of 4 young people, the driver had been drinking, they'd been driving at speed, maybe chased by another driver, 3 of them not wearing their seatbelts who died, 1 wearing his seatbelt survived. If this had been, you know, 4 young people out after a night in Essex, no one would think there was anything unusual about it. But it's this search for a deeper, bigger meaning. But I think, sadly, it was just a tragic accident. 9/11, absolutely not an inside job, but certainly some systemic failures in the US intelligence community, specifically in relation to poor information sharing between FBI and CIA. And so you get these things that look odd. Oh, well, why would these people be on the watch list, but it wouldn't be notified? Well, because these organizations don't talk to each other as much as they should, and often, I won't say hate each other, but you know, and we see it in the UK with MI5 and MI6 and some of the nicknames and views that they have about each other. So yeah, not an inside job. No, nobody looked the other way, but there's no getting away from the fact that afterwards, and this is, I think, what people don't often factor in enough, is that people use an event like that and then say, well, how can we derive some sort of advantage from it, whether it's political, military, or economic. But I don't think it was an inside job. Iraq is actually one of the more interesting theories, and a little closer to home. No, I don't think the intelligence was manufactured in relation to WMD, but I think political leaders either didn't understand what intelligence is and what it isn't, and or they wanted to use this to achieve a wider geopolitical agenda. So I think the bottom line is and this is the direct quote that people should remember, the intelligence was sporadic and patchy. There were some indications that there were WMD, and Saddam had used WMD, not least on his own people before. So it wasn't an unreasonable assumption, but at the end of the day, the real answer was we didn't know. But then I think a possibility was either misinterpreted or misrepresented as a certainty. And if you read Tony Blair's introduction to the dodgy dossier, I think what he uses is the phrase, what I believe the intelligence shows beyond reasonable doubt is ... And any intelligence analyst would have said that's not what the intelligence shows. Does that mean we went to war on a lie? Probably not. Does it mean that there were WMD? We don't know. But what it absolutely means is that people probably didn't understand how intelligence works and that it's not binary.
And coronavirus, 5G,
No,
Bill Gates.
no. You know, yes, somebody like Bill Gates may say as a result of this, well, I believe this validates my views on vaccination, but no one's creating this to vaccinate world populations. And I've already covered, obviously, Sir Richard Dearlove's rather interesting recent comments on that. We'll have to see how that plays out. But even his comments, you know, nobody was saying this was engineered as a bioweapon and deliberately put out there. But there are some questions still to ask. And yes, it seems to be a zoonotic virus that just made that leap. I think there will be questions asked about were crippling national lockdowns really the way to go, as opposed to targeting resources on those people genuinely at serious risk through enhanced shielding, through deep cleaning of care homes, etc. So yes, there will be some things that I think history shows got wrong, and mishandled, and there was panic and there was hysteria. But I don't think it is a deliberately engineered situation to achieve outcomes, not least because those outcomes are not beneficial to governments. I mean, I've used this phrase before, but economies have been crashed and millions of jobs lost and trillions of dollars have been incurred on this, and that's not where government wanted to be. So no, it's not a conspiracy.
David Icke?
Wrong on almost every count. I mean, he's a nice enough guy. I've met him a couple of times. He's eloquent. He's articulate. Maybe in some of his areas, he's kind of stumbled across a half truth. But before you misunderstand me, no, I'm not talking shape-shifting reptilian lizard people from outer space. No, I mean, more in terms of what you said about questioning authority, and I mean, there is undoubtedly manipulation going on all the time. Every time you watch an advert, you are being manipulated. Every time you listen to a political speech, you are being manipulated, but not really in the way that David Icke, I think, would have people believe.
Very, very interesting. And it is where we sort of started, really, about the whole thing about question everything. But finally, then, if people watching this, the advice that you would give them in terms of the news and the sources, and I think we would probably come up with the same thing about question everything, look for sources, get as many different sources as possible. And it's only that way that you can make an informed decision, isn't it?
Yes, and I go back to the other point. Even if you strongly disagree with something and think it's this is a TV network put out by a totalitarian state, go and watch it. See what they're saying. If nothing else, you'll get an insight into their culture and their mindset. And I think we probably all agree that whatever the nature of different regimes, just understanding them better and building that bridge of understanding, at least knowing where they're coming from, is important. I mean, people. I once went to. I was involved in a negotiation. I'll just use this, maybe a final anecdote. I was once involved in some negotiations. I was not present, but I was doing some of the briefing about the handing back of Hong Kong. And in the morning session, very little progress was made, and things were getting very exasperated. And they broke for lunch. The senior British negotiator turned to his opposite number on the Hong Kong government and said, "Let's go for lunch. I hope we'll make better progress in the afternoon session. Got a good restaurant. Let's not talk business over lunch." There was a stunned silence, and it was met with a comment along the lines of, "You will not tell me what I may or may not discuss at lunch and in the restaurant." And of course, it had not been meant as an insult or anything other than a friendly social situation. But in that Hong Kong and maybe the wider China society, that was a big deal, and it caused a big problem. And then we got beyond it. But I just throw that in as a result of an illustration, I suppose, of that sort of point. I once attended a closed session on Israel's response to Iran's apparent attempt to develop nuclear weapons. And there was I can't remember who was giving the briefing. It was at the House of Commons. It was open to, I think, by invitation to certain members of the press, but it wasn't, I think, absolutely, walk in off the streets public. And I can't remember who it was, but he was somebody very close to Netanyahu. And somewhere in the Q&A, the phrase or question was used, well, Israel should do this or Israel should do that. And again, there was that step back and that bristly response of no country will tell Israel what Israel should do. We will make our own decisions based on the evidence as we see it. And so I guess there's an element of cultural difference about that. There's an element, it maybe speaks to some of the other things that we've discussed about the importance of words and how they're used. But I think maybe we'll keep that for another time.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. And I think as a headline, I always say perception and reality are not always aligned. And a lot of it goes down to intention and trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You'll get a much better idea. And actually the world will be a better place. If we can learn to communicate, learn to have better understanding and shed more light and less heat on situations, I think we'll be in a much better place.
Indeed, and I'm probably misquoting, but I think it's Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird who has the scout character say, if you can step into someone's shoes and walk in them, and obviously that's particularly topical at the moment for all sorts of reasons, but yes, building those bridges, understanding, even if you think of someone as the other side, whether it's Russia or China, but if you, going back to your question about multiple sources, see what even someone you regard as the enemy, though I don't like that phrase, but see what they're saying, and very often you'll get an insight into how they're thinking. But it's only when you get those little boots on the ground anecdotes, like let's not discuss this over dinner, that you realize sometimes the gap is wider than you think.
No, you're absolutely right. And they always say, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies even closer. And I think understanding where they come from is absolutely right. And just to finish on for today, how would you, Nick Pope, after 40 years, how would you, Nick Pope, like to be remembered?
Well, I think ultimately, because family is more important to me, I think I'd like to be remembered as a good husband to Elizabeth, and somebody who was, a good son and maybe a good friend too. I suppose outside of the family and small social circle, that's not how I will be remembered. I will probably be that guy who investigated UFOs. But what I do hope is that whether it's through UFOs or whether it's through astronomy, some discovery, I hope within a generation we will find out that we're not alone. And in which case, even if I didn't play a direct part, I hope it will be Nick Pope, that guy who investigated UFOs, and that guy who got it right.
Yeah, fantastic. And what I love as well, Nick Pope, the guy who got it right, is you've got the picture behind you, which is going to be the one which is drawn. Who drew that glorious picture? I see bookshelves around the world, but the picture with you and the alien, and all the conspiracy theorists will say, look, that was done at an event very recently. Nick was there. Who did the picture?
Yeah. Yes, I can't remember without breaking away from my thing, but there are a lot of very skilled artists in this field, and they were kind enough to draw that, and some other ones too. I remember one time before I did an interview like this, and I actually had 3 of them in view, and somebody says, well, that certainly takes some chutzpah.
Well, certainly that's evidence from 3 sources, is what we'd say if I was looking for that.
Indeed.
Nick, it's such a pleasure catching up after so long.
Likewise. Well, let's stay in touch outside of this, and of course, I hope that everyone watching this will find it interesting and enjoyable. Whether they agree or disagree, I hope it's food for thought.
Food for thought, and continue to question everything. Nick Pope, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
So that was the legendary Nick Pope, who I went to school with all those years ago. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Anyway, whatever your views are, please share them. Put in the comments below. If you want to subscribe to Octopus TV for more of the same, let me know. And also, if you want to be on the show or have suggestions for other guests, write to me at lol@octopustv.com. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.